The primary objective of science is truth. That of alchemy, operational success. Spreadsheets and charts, valuation metrics and financial reports. We've all seen the business school approaches to investing, yet some of the greatest traders, investors, and businessmen of all history have used quite different methods with astonishing success. This is the story of some more arcane forms of investing, those who use more esoteric, mystical methods in order to bring about success. While these methods are uncommon, they most certainly deliver. So let's explore these wizards of wealth, these market magicians, and their occult finance. One of these more metaphysical topics that may be more accessible and familiar to people is the notion of cyclical history. While most people in the modern West tend to think of history as linear, many religious and philosophical systems throughout history and around the world have notions of history as a cycle. The Hindus have a notion of kalpas, the cycle of Brahman, which is a grand cycle of creation and destruction, or the day and night of Brahman. It is divided into the yugas, long periods of history that have very distinct characters. Together these 4 long yugas make up the Mahayuga, the Great Age. In this system, civilizations, spirituality, the way that people think and live is quite different depending on when they are born. There's a fundamentally different character to each of the yugas. The Buddhists have a cycle of expansion, endurance, contraction, and void, while have a belief that individuals follow their own cycle, the cycle of samsara, the constant suffering of death and rebirth, which can only be broken by achieving the state of nirvana. The ancient Stoics had the idea that the universe was created and destroyed multiple times, and each time it would come back the same for the cycle to repeat all over again. The Jains believe that history can be divided into 2 halves of the cycle. One, the declining half, where lifespans, happiness, and spirituality decline, and an ascending half, where humans experience growth and prosperity. One very common theme that all of these people came to independently is that there is a pattern of how people live, and not only how they live, but how they think, their spiritual nature, that humans go through cycles that's very fundamental to their psychology and spiritual being. You might live in an age of sadness and hopelessness, yet as the cycles give way, people will become optimistic and spiritual. Going to some philosophical systems that people would consider to be more occult, Helena Blavatsky's theosophy believed that the evolution of humanity and Earth occurs through great cycles. These cycles, further subdivided into 7, experience a rise and a fall. Something we really start seeing is the idea that there are growth and decline periods, something quite akin to boom and bust cycles, that the nature of growth and expansion and life must inherently give way to death and decline. Many have drawn comparisons to the seasons, that the life and renewal of spring inherently contains within it the necessity for the cold and death of winter. Rudolf Steiner proposed that the world goes through a series of epochs, and that as humanity progresses through the epochs, human consciousness and spirituality would change along with it. This one is an evolutionary model, that the pattern that underlies the universe is evolutionary in nature, and humans, following along with it, evolve in the same manner. Traditional alchemy, which can trace its origins back to Greece and Egypt, has a notion of the circuit of equinoxes through the zodiac. In this model, humanity and the world progress through the zodiacal ages, like the age of Pisces or the age of Aquarius, and that as we progress through this cosmic cycle, our psychology and spirituality changes along with it. So there are a few things embedded in here. One is the broader, more general concept of history existing in a pattern, but another is that human character and consciousness changes over time. That humans aren't simply being carried along while the world changes around them, but humans themselves are being changed. And we will see this pop up frequently with some investment philosophies. I also want to point out the evolutionary model that starts getting in here. There's an idea that the cyclicality occurs because of evolution. Naturally, the pattern of all things is to repeat. Yet with change, or a mutation, there is a deviation, and this causes evolution to occur. So as the cycle continues, there's subtle deviation over time, building up to large changes in character. So let's look at a couple investors. In his book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, Bridgewater Associates founder, Ray Dalio, proposes a notion of the big cycle. In his model, all of global history, be it economic, financial, or political, follow big cycles, which correspond to the rise and fall of great powers. Powers like the Roman Empire, or the British, Dutch, and perhaps the Americans. He believes that there are three primary factors which underlie these cycles. The first is a financial cycle. In his model, great powers accumulate debt. As they become increasingly vast, and as their populations demand more and more spoils, rising powers will feel on top of the world, and so they will take on a lot of debt. Yet over time, that debt becomes a larger and larger share of their overall economy, and eventually the debt is too burdensome that they can no longer handle it. And thus, as great powers get on in age, and find that they're no longer the powerhouse they once were, they find that this debt is beginning to eat away at them. They're becoming more strained, and they no longer have the momentum nor strength to justify their borrowing. Thus, they will become crippled and decline on the weight of their own debt. The second factor he identifies is an internal order and disorder cycle. In this model, internal divisions become more and more stark over time. One particularly powerful driving force is disparities in wealth. That as the ruling class of the great power is more proximate to wealth creation, more and more spoils of empire accrue to them. Yet, as time goes on, the great power is able to generate less and less. Disparities in wealth are one thing, when the poorer populations feel themselves to be growing. But as that growth begins to slow down, those who are benefiting at the top of the power accumulate more and more, while those at the bottom find their quality of life slipping away. This eventually leads to conflict, and the once great power finds that with internal division and strife, it's not only financially at risk, but it's at risk from the inside. The perception of legitimacy of its ruling class begins to erode, and people within the civilization view themselves as enemies. He argues that frequently this leads to one fraction of the population revolting and taking the wealth from those who were previously at the top. The final main factor that he identifies is an external world order cycle. He argues that eventually a rising new power will challenge the previous great power. He proposes that two great powers cannot coexist, at least not at a particular scale, and thus as the old great power is beset by debt and internal conflict, it will find that the only way for it to continue is to fight with a new rising great power. The previous great power may defeat the new rising power, giving it more time to exist in its prosperous and powerful state. Yet, very likely it will be defeated, and the new rising power will subsume its place at the top of the global order. A question that this really brings up that's worth noting is, if we assume that history is cyclical, does this cyclicality exist because human nature is inherently cyclical? I.e., because of how humans behave, they tend to respond to some things in certain ways, causing certain outcomes, causing certain responses, causing certain behaviors, causing certain outcomes. Thus, human nature reinforces itself in a cyclical manner. Or is there an underlying cyclicality to reality itself, and humans exist in a cyclical state not simply because they are driving it, but because they exist in a reality that is inherently cyclical on a metaphysical layer? So let's look at another investor, perhaps the most legendary occult investor, George Soros. Throughout this video, George Soros' model of reflexivity will come up a lot, and that's because it will touch on a great many things. Very often people look at it at surface level, but when one actually digs into Soros' writing, there are quite a great many ideas that reflexivity attaches itself to. So in Soros' model of reflexivity, perceptions and reality form a self-reinforcing cyclical pattern. Perception influences reality, reality influences perception, and perception influences reality, and so on. To give a very simplistic example, imagine that there's a stock of some great new technology company. Let's call it a synthetic cleverness company. Well, perhaps it doesn't have much of a future. In reality, its product isn't very good, and it's losing money. However, if people believe that the company is going to succeed, then they will begin bidding up the stock. The company now has a lower cost of equity financing. The company finds that it can invest in many more projects, and thus, to investors, it looks as though the company is improving. The company that should have been floundering and losing money, because people believed a false story about it, now has more research and development. It has new projects, and its stock is rising. And so, new investors look at this and think, wow, this company must be doing very well. After all, everyone believes in it. Its stock is exploding, and look at its growth. So they will in turn pile in, pushing the stock up higher. This will continue for some time. Belief that the company is a great investment will in turn make the company a great investment. Yet eventually this will deviate too far from reality, and people will have to come face to face with that truth. At this point, it all collapses. Faster than it was bid up, people run to the exits. And this company that never really was ends up creating and destroying fortunes. The outcome of Soros's perception and reality reflexive cycle is a boom and bust cycle. Howard Marks, the founder of Occult, as well has a psychological model of market cycles. He proposes two fundamental driving currents: greed and fear. Embodied by his support for the idea that history doesn't repeat but it rhymes, he supports a human nature-driven model of cyclicality. His model comes down to four basic cycles: an economic cycle, a cycle of the creation of goods and services. Whereas optimism increases, people produce more. And on the other end, when fear sets in, people produce less. Fear itself creates economic decline. His second major cycle is the profit cycle, a cycle of corporate profits, where when a new business avenue is identified, intrepid businessmen go there, and they find that it's enormously profitable. This will create a boom time for the industry, and eventually, people will see this. They will see the wealth being created, and more people will go there. This in turn grows the industry, and optimism is very high. Yet over time, it becomes more and more crowded. And while it is becoming more and more crowded, people are becoming more and more greedy. People begin ignoring the warning signs of shrinking profits, and eventually too many participants are in an industry. Profits become too small, and thus, businesses fail. This causes a great pessimism, as people realize that this isn't the gold mine that they thought it was. And then more and more businesses leave, leaving a cycle of high profits to low profits. The third major cycle he identifies is perhaps the one that he believes is most significant, and this is the credit cycle. In this model, lenders will begin lending. Originally, credit will be a bit restrictive, and they will lend to businesses that they believe have the greatest chance of success. And as these businesses make money, more and more enter and more loans are made. Eventually, credit becomes looser. Lenders have to compete on their rates. Thus, the economy becomes more and more liquid with ample credit. However, eventually this will go too far. Borrowers will begin defaulting, and lenders become more strict. And as this happens, refinancing becomes more difficult, and loan origination more scarce. This chills the economy, and the credit supply dries up. Yet eventually, in the environment of scarce credit, some intrepid lender will begin lending again, beginning the cycle all over. His last is the risk cycle, which is perhaps the most purely psychological of the four. In this cycle, he proposes that there is a pattern to how investors think about risk. He argues that in good times, investors are less risk-averse and throw their money at speculative bets. However, over time, too much money gets flooded into things that just don't pan out. Eventually, assets begin selling off, and investors become risk-averse. Yet over time, this risk aversion drives valuations too low. And spotting an opportunity, eventually people begin to buy back in carefully. People become willing to take on risk again. Then over time, this grows and grows. People become more exuberant and less risk-averse, only for it to go too far, for things to sell off, and people to become risk-averse again. The last one that I want to touch on, as it appears in investing spaces frequently, is the Strauss-Howe generational model. This is a model created by William Strauss and Neil Howe. It divides history into quadrants, which they metaphorically align with the seasons. a spring awakening, a summer high, an autumn unraveling, and a winter crisis. These 4 quadrants they term turnings, and the way this system works is that depending on when one is born, generations follow a pattern. This pattern has to do with their proximity to the last major crisis and to their formative events. For example, take the baby boom, born in the spring high following the Second World War. Their childhoods were in a time of great prosperity, where the older generations had just been through the crisis of World War II. This caused them to take on what the authors term as a prophet archetype, where they feel stifled, and they want to inject their idealism into the world. In turn, this loose and idealistic period, which is termed the high, for example the 1960s, causes social deterioration. The next generation, Generation X, who grew up during these years, sees the social decay and becomes more self-reliant, taking on the characteristics of what is termed a nomad generation. This leads to a period called the unraveling, where social institutions created during the last crisis begin to fall apart, and social bonds weaken. The children of this time, for example the 1980s and 90s, thus become much more civically minded, particularly if they are raised by those who wish to turn away from the errors of the previous high. They take on what is termed the hero archetype. Yet, as this goes on and the institutions are not salvaged, eventually this leads to a period of crisis. For example, the Second World War, the Civil War, or right now. The children of this era see that society has no solutions, and they become much more creative, thinking outside the box, attempting to create something on the other side of the crisis. This, for example, would be Gen Z, which the authors term an artist generation. Cyclical history is a very interesting concept, certainly with arguments for and against it, although many great thinkers have come to a sort of hybrid model, perhaps general patterns, which deviate over time through something like a mutation. One of the main arguments against it is how large changes have been in history, 2 of these being great man theory and technology theories, the idea that technology is what affects history and the nature of human societies. Yet in favor of it is the general observation that human nature hasn't changed enormously, and that as humans respond to the same things in the same way, when faced with similar situations as our ancestors had, at core we're still the same people, and thus will respond similarly, causing similar patterns to emerge. So perhaps that's not truly cyclical, more in line with history rhymes, but there are certainly great observations in here that are worth taking seriously. Pythagoras is thought to have been born in 570 BC. Of course, he's quite famous with every child in school for his formulation of the Pythagorean theorem, yet he is an extremely significant figure across mathematics, geometry, music, and mysticism. He's responsible for the theory of proportions, the discovery of the planet Venus in the night sky, and perhaps the 5 regular solids. Yet a recurring observation and belief of his was that everything in reality can be described via waves and cycles. He proposed that all is number, and that everything in reality can be understood through mathematical relationships, and that numbers themselves inherently have mystical quality. This way of thinking appears frequently in Greco-Roman mysticism, as well as many modern occult schools. For example, he proposed that the solar system could be described via a melody, that as everything can be described in a series of ratios, particularly ratios between waveforms, then the movements of the planets, the stars, and the cosmos could be described melodically via those waveforms, and thus be translated into a song. By extension, it was argued that as all reality can be described by waves and ratios, then everything in being could be described through melody and harmony. So if there is a metaphysical music of the heavens, then perhaps too there is a music of the markets. Jewish Kabbalists have a similar notion. In all schools of Kabbalist thought, the relationship between the divine infinite and the created finite is analyzed, with that relationship being represented by the tree of life. Further, Kabbalists developed the practice of assigning numbers to the characters of the Hebrew alphabet. Within most Kabbalist systems, it's believed that the universe was constructed linguistically, and that it was defined into existence, and thus as relationships can be understood via numeric relationships, the underlying language of creation can as well be translated mathematically. Freemasons have a notion that geometry is the original noble science, used by the great architect of the universe, which is their term for the creative deity. Within their most famous symbol, the square represents the material and the compass the spiritual, where in studying the geometry of architecture, they believe that they can find underlying patterns in the structure of the universe, which expresses itself through sacred proportions, the geometric relationships within reality's architecture. Christians as well hold that there are numbers of great significance. For example, 3, 7, and 12. Islam generally avoids figures and uses geometric patterns to express complexity and divinity. Hindus utilize the geometry of architecture to optimize harmony and energy flow, while both Hindus and Buddhists believe that geometry represents the cosmos and sacred relationships. Everywhere we look, through all sorts of systems throughout history and across the world, people have come to believe that there is a mathematical underpinning to reality, that there is a metaphysic to ratio, waves, or numeric values themselves, and that there is some deeper layer of reality which can be understood by studying these relationships. One very sharp divide within investing is the merit or non-merit of technical analysis. Some hold that there are inherent behaviors within markets, and that those behaviors, as seen in a chart, can be understood geometrically, while others believe that this is simply drawing meaningless lines on charts. Perhaps there are deeper relationships, but the idea that a simple line will illustrate it is rejected by many. One very prime example of numerical relationships which is utilized in investment is the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio. There is a notion of Fibonacci retracements. In this system, horizontal lines are drawn on charts representing key locations within the Fibonacci sequence, a sequence constructed of summing the previous two values in the sequence. For example, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and so on. Notable technical analyst W.D. Gann proposed a notion of time and price squaring, where geometric angles and numerical ratios could be used to predict when price movements will end. He used the Pythagorean theorem to find key turning points in price actions. Yet another related theory is Elliott wave theory, which proposes that market prices move in repeating self-similar patterns. Often the Fibonacci sequence is used for this purpose, where sequence and ratios determine the length and targets of waves. And while many reject this form of analysis, including many of the best investors, it's quite notable that there are also highly successful investors who take it seriously. For example, Paul Tudor Jones is a proponent of Elliott wave theory. Perhaps digging a little deeper into mathematics, we get to the quant funds. Some of these funds have had truly astronomical returns, such as Renaissance Technologies, 2 Sigma, or Citadel. They have developed statistical systems based off of Brownian motion, which is the observation of the behavior of particles in a medium, such as a liquid or gas, the seemingly random pattern as they bounce all around. Geometric Brownian motion is an extension of this. In geometric Brownian motion, the log of the variable which we are plotting is assumed to follow Brownian motion. It is assumed to be a stochastic process with drift, and can be considered an exponential form of Brownian motion. While this may at glance seem as though it's simply going to be random noise, it is an underlying assumption used in the Black-Scholes-Merton model, where the price of the underlying at a given time is assumed to follow this motion. Thus, this has very far-reaching applications, as the BSM model is the most ubiquitously used options pricing model in all financial markets. Simultaneously, it appears as though quant funds have a sort of sacred geometry of their own. Differential and information geometry are used quite frequently in statistical models. One such example is to view a portfolio's risk-return profile as a complex n-dimensional surface. This manifold can exist in however many dimensions the portfolio manager needs. Once this is constructed, the goal is to find the flattest spot on the surface, maximizing returns and minimizing risk sensitivity, the curvature of the manifold. So what exactly is going on here? Is there an underlying geometry to the universe? Does reality, at its most fundamental, exist in waveforms? Can we study these waveforms to gain a better understanding of the world in which we live? While certainly many of the greatest minds of all human history have thought so, including many of today's scientists. Does this mean chart reading? Does this mean statistical models? Does this mean cyclical waves? Or perhaps something else entirely? Whatever the answer is, this has been one of the greatest puzzles for all of human thought, and thus it makes sense why the greatest minds of our financial markets would find themselves gravitating to its mystery. A notion very fundamental to alchemy is the Hermetic idea that all is mind. The premise is that the creation of reality is a mental process, and that all which exists within the great divine being, the All. And as creation is mental, and humans possess mind, then humans participate in the creation of reality. People may be familiar with the phrase, as above, so below. This notion reflects the idea that the ordering of reality, as plays out on the grandest scale, exists just the same on the smallest. Thus, as the greater mental divine reality can be changed, when we ourselves change our own inner world, the result is to change reality itself. In more modern systems, particularly modern sigil magic, is the idea that an intention can be condensed into a sigil, a physical symbolic representation of the intention, that sigil can be charged and then deliberately forgotten. This, in turn, allows the intention to bypass the conscious mind and integrate itself into the subconscious, thus creating a new reality. So what do we do with this? Well, the alchemists of the early modern periods believed that to bring about changes in the world, there must be physical transformation. Yet, that part of the process was a mental transformation. The stages of the magnum opus to create the lapis philosophorum, or the Philosopher's Stone, was as much an internal spiritual process as it is physical. Turning lead into gold can be seen as taking one's previous mental state and creating new gold from it, after undergoing the alchemist's transformation. So what does this have to do with markets? Well, let's return to our friend, George Soros. Let's look more closely at what happens during a reflexive cycle. In his model of reflexivity, the perceptions of market participants influence their actions, and the actions of the market participants influence reality. A belief that an investment is better than it is causes it to become a better investment than it is, and in turn this becomes the new reality, causing people to believe this, reinforcing the perception, reinforcing the reality. Yet this is not the full extent of what he thought about. No, he recognized that a reflexive cycle isn't something to simply be observed and then ridden up and down, though he certainly did this, but that if one understood these principles, then he could create reality. Once one understands the minds of a people, he can begin the reflexive cycle at will. He doesn't need to wait for perception to manifest a new reality, for the alchemist can manifest the perception. Say, for example, you had a media company, or even just one friend in the media. All it would take was one carefully placed story, something that you knew would really get at the unconscious mind, without even knowing that a story had upset someone or excited them. Then your story which you had created would in turn be able to affect their perception, affecting reality, affecting perception, affecting reality. This is where sigil magic enters. For if you are able to form the perfect narrative, something which bypasses the conscious mind and really goes to work on the subconscious, then this will have maximal impact on the conscious mind. It would be one thing to simply tell somebody a story, tell them that a stock is going to do quite well, or perhaps something more emotionally jarring. Perhaps tell people that things are about to get a lot worse, or maybe that there will be a great outbreak of disease. If you are able to construct it in such a way where the observer of your narrative is not consciously aware that you're feeding it to them, but instead you design it to affect their unconscious mind, then this will have far more impact, as the conscious mind won't be as readily able to address it. Thus you have begun the alchemical process of transformation for somebody else, by giving them a narrative unconsciously. Once the alchemical process begins, then over time their conscious and subconscious will become aligned, accepting this as their new reality. And if this exists across enough people, then this, in turn, becomes reality. It's playing with the unconscious mind that creates reality. And if you are a brilliant trader and know what the story is going to be, then for all intents and purposes, you have caused the future to happen. Another legendary investor who has thought frequently about unconscious processes is Peter Thiel. He has quite frequently spoken about Girardian mimetics and applied it to his work. René Girard's mimetic theory holds that desire is not a simple linear process between a subject, the desirer, and the object of desire, but is instead a triangular process mediated by a third party, the mediator. In this model, the subject desires the object because the mediator desires it. People desire things because others desire them. This theory is best encapsulated in the phrase, "Man does not know what to desire." The theory holds that there is a romantic lie, that desire is unique and personal, when really they are social and copied. A mediator may be an external mediator. In this situation, the mediator is distant, perhaps a celebrity or a historic figure. Or there can be internal mediation where the mediator is close, perhaps a friend or a family member. In the case of internal mediation, this closeness inevitably leads to rivalry, as the subject comes to see the mediator as an obstacle to the object, over time generating a feedback loop, where the rivalry becomes more important than the original object. As this expands across a society, this causes a mimetic crisis, as rivalry spreads as a contagion. Once a society enters a mimetic crisis, it becomes a war of all against all. Yet there is a way to end this process and return to a state of peace. A scapegoat must be identified. To end the cycle, a community unconsciously and mimetically unites around a scapegoat. This scapegoat must then in turn be exiled or killed. The killing of the scapegoat calms people, and as the people look around and see this sudden calm, this only reinforces their belief that the scapegoat was in fact guilty. This becomes the basis of a foundational lie for the society. The community believes its own narrative of the scapegoat's guilt, and the story of the killing of the scapegoat becomes a sacred event that society bases its beliefs on. Girard argues that Christianity is highly unique, and that it is the only religious system which views this process through the point of view of the scapegoat. So assume you are an investor with the power and connections of George Soros, or have access to all the newest technology before it even comes out, like Peter Thiel, and you know that the unconscious mind can be manipulated, and once that has happened, it operates under its own feedback loop, requiring no further input from you. You just need to know the starting condition. Well, what would you do? What would you do with that knowledge? The subconscious is very squishy, and most people do not like to spend much time there. Thus, if you are somebody who thinks a great deal about it, and studies these mechanisms, studies examples of how it is played out historically, then perhaps you may have more say in how somebody thinks than they do. Taoism is a body of ancient Chinese philosophical ideas, ones which really began to emerge as their own distinct school of thought in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. One of its most foundational works, the Tao Te Ching, is attributed to Lao Tzu in the 4th century BC. It describes a concept of balance, an inherent duality in nature between yin and yang, with one of its most core ideas being Wu Wei, effortless action. This idea is that to act in accordance with the way, action should be effortless. This isn't to say that one should give no effort in life, but simply that when one is in accordance with the way, then action should be as though it required no effort, like drifting calmly down a river. Some investors have drawn parallels to value investing, a classic investment philosophy, particularly crystallized by Ben Graham, which places a value on contrarianism and believes that an investor should focus on the value of an underlying asset, and not the market itself, buying things when they trade below their inherent worth. There's a certain long-term perspective in this, in which it is incumbent on the investor to resist the urge to constantly trade. A proper value investment should be effortless. Once the proper trade has been identified, the investor should buy the asset, and if this is done in accordance with the way, or in this case, value, then it will require no further effort on the part of the investor. He need only wait for market participants to realize the value in the asset. There is a calm and a stillness in this, that the investor shouldn't go out constantly looking for trades, but should instead remain calm and allow good investments to come to him. Avoid busyness and stay still. The notions of yin and yang correspond identically to the alchemical masculine and feminine, a notion that there are inherently two different qualities, two sides to the same coin, which remain in tension, yet when ultimately joined in the proper harmony, are able to create something greater than the sum of their parts, just as men and women can make children. Biological male and female are simply a reflection of this much deeper metaphysical quality, masculine and feminine, yin and yang. In the value investing as Tao philosophy, market cycles can be seen as a manifestation of the forces of yin and yang, with the greedy bullish part of the cycle as the masculine yang, and the fear bearish part of the cycle as the feminine yin. The investor must act contrary to achieve balance. The investor must lead yang when the market is yin, and yin when the market is yang, as ultimately in the long run the market will revert to the mean. In this, when yin and yang achieve harmony with each other, then the market has found Tao, the way. Taoist thought places a value on humility and simplicity. Ideas like intrinsic value and the margin of safety mirror this perfectly, as the investor should achieve simplicity in operations and understanding of what he can and can't control, seeking only to act on what is within his control. The investor cannot control what other market participants do, but if he is able to find inherent value and sees that the market is not properly pricing an asset, then it is within his control to buy the asset at a price below inherent value, or sell when it is above. The investor must remain humble, accept losses, and stick to the plan, achieving success through effortless action. Some of recent history's most successful investors have had some form of this philosophy, with perhaps the most famous examples being Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. They deviate from Ben Graham's original formulation of value, which placed its emphasis entirely on price relative to intrinsic value. Buffett and Munger believed in quality, and that the investor should not simply seek out investments trading below their intrinsic value, but should look for businesses which have quality to them. Seth Klarman, the founder of Baupost, utilized perhaps an even more extreme version of this philosophy, deep value, a philosophy shared with Sir John Templeton, Walter Schloss, as well as other highly successful investors. This is a highly contrarian form of value investing, one which can be encapsulated in Templeton's notion of the point of maximum pessimism, where the best value investments are the ones most out of favor with investors, as the greatest returns will come from investments which are most mispriced, not simply being cheap relative to intrinsic value, but actively hated by investors, in so doing achieving balance. When investors are yin with a stock, then the deep value investor should be yang. Both Eastern Taoist alchemy and Western Hermetic alchemy converge at exactly the same observation, the divine masculine and feminine, a notion that there are two fundamental driving forms in reality, forces which everything is ultimately a byproduct of. So when looking at markets, society, psychology, it's worth thinking about the masculine and feminine, yin and yang, the two which remain forever in tension until ultimately they join harmoniously, with reality a cycle of this dance over and over, like the courtship and mating of men and women, simply a reflection of this greater force. So even if this isn't always what an investor is thinking, this plays a profound role on all human psychology, in markets and without. So next time you see a story of some great hot stock that everyone is expecting to make them rich, or there is a rush of doom stories and panic sellers dumping everything, it's worth reflecting on balance, harmony, and effortless action. A very fundamental idea throughout all of human history is the notion of spiritual beings. Within the West, they're generally understood as angels and demons, though perhaps with some lingering notions of ideas like spirits and sprites. In the Islamic world, there's the idea of jinns, neither quite good nor evil, though often quite tricky, and capable of great destruction. The Shinto of Japan see a great multitude of spirits in all things. Within Jewish thought, there's the idea of dybbaks, entities which attach themselves to humans and with sufficient strength are capable of taking over a person. Within the business world, perhaps the most famous story is that of Les Wexner, the highly successful businessman and investor who founded Limited Brands. A quite fascinating story was published about him, where he described that his motivation, his energy, and his drive came from a dybbuk which inhabited his body. That each morning, he would wake up and the dybbuk would be gnawing at him, propelling him to succeed. He would say that his great success and fortune came from this entity, that the dybbuk both motivated him and showed him how to succeed, yet that it was never satisfied, always gnawing at him. Some have conjectured that this is a metaphoric explanation, him describing some sort of internal restlessness, yet within the secular materialist modern world, there remains a vast number of people who still place great significance on the world of spirit. Many people, including many of the most wealthy and powerful, see an underlying spiritual reality, some of whom believe in angels, demons, sprites, jinns, and dybbaks. While the modern notion of dybbaks arose primarily out of Jewish folklore, a great number of its associated ideas are developed in Jewish Kabbalism, a vast corpus of mystical philosophy which evolved over centuries and is a major component of many modern forms of rabbinical Judaism, developing particularly in Andalusia and North Africa during the medieval period. It took many of its ideas from those which were contemporaneously being studied by Islamic mystics. Other ideas it took from Greco-Egyptian mysticism, some from earlier Middle Eastern traditions, and even some from more Manichaean, Gnostic European ideas. It's very difficult to actually say what Judaism is, as throughout the centuries, many different schools of thought all evolved independently. Some are much closer to traditional folkloric, Torah-based traditions, while others are a quite curious soup of ideas from many different places, developed by Kabbalist rabbis. WeWork founder Adam Newman would be highly public about the influence which Kabbalah had had on him. He would even describe his company's goal as being to elevate humanity's consciousness. He would utilize Kabbalist numerology in his business, placing particular value on certain numbers, while attempting to use Kabbalist methods to tap into a higher order of consciousness, in turn using that for the business. There are a great many businessmen and investors who speak in terms of spiritual forces. Some may perhaps be using the terms metaphorically, though there are certainly a great number of believers in spiritual entities. Perhaps on the more materialist side, John Maynard Keynes would speak frequently in terms of animal spirits, guiding spiritual forces which motivate economies and markets. The great investor Stan Druckenmiller would very often evoke many of Keynes's notions in this manner, though perhaps where we see this language and these ideas most prevalently is in the tech sector and venture capital investing. Elon Musk very frequently speaks of demons, early on in a manner which seemed particularly materialistic, though as over time veered much more spiritual, often drawing parallels to the game Dungeons & Dragons. He speaks about the internal spiritual battle between the drive to good and demons which attempt to bring people downward. He has even spoken about certain technologies as being capable of possessing demonic qualities, particularly in improperly developed artificial intelligence. Perhaps a more clear example of this way of thinking is Peter Thiel, who has frequently discussed angels and demons, lending support to the idea that extraterrestrial life are what earlier humans had considered to be angels and demons. In 2025, he would give a lecture series on the Antichrist. describing the capacity for technological systems to become a demonic force. In the case of Teal, this seems to both hold a metaphoric quality and a quite literal spiritual quality. There's a sense within certain spheres of technologists and venture capitalists that just as humans are capable of being swayed by spiritual forces of good and evil, that technology may be capable of becoming inhabited by the same entities. While many people may look at the tech sector and associate it with materialist science, if anything, it has been an area of society which has been most prolific in developing new spiritual ideas. Perhaps one of the largest ones is the Singularity cult. It takes a certain hybrid of Buddhist and Messianic Jewish ideas, in line with the notion that technology is capable of possessing spiritual quality. They believe that when artificial intelligence reaches a sufficiently intelligent level, then it will be capable of revealing the underlying makeup of reality. And in understanding the fundamental nature of reality, it in turn possesses the quality of God, and is thus able to bring about a new age, creating reality itself. Some have even conjectured that this is where our universe came from, an infinite cycle of intelligence creating intelligence, and that our building of modern AI systems is simply another link in that unbroken chain. These singularity cults are not simply ideologues. There are even communes for them which now exist around the Bay Area, as fully formed millenarian cults. Exclusive clubs and secret societies have always been things which are highly valued by status seekers. Certainly throughout history, Masonic lodges have been a gathering place, often for very well-connected and influential people. Particularly in the 18th century, Masonic lodges were foundational to liberal Enlightenment ideas, and as a result, the idea of influential people meeting and discussing rather atheist-seeming ideas was not particularly well liked. While over the years, the Blue Lodges have become more general social clubs, and ones not particularly associated with any class or strata of society. Some affiliate bodies remain quite strong. Notable examples would be the York Rite, the Scottish Rite, the Royal Order of the Jesters, and the Nobles of the Mystic Shrine. There's great variety in what different affiliate bodies are actually like, and while some have veered into more wild party and drinking clubs, some have quite genuinely continued to study metaphysical and occult ideas. Particularly within Jewish business circles, there are societies of Kabbalists, some directly mystical groups, while others more loose affiliations based on shared religious background within rabbinical Judaism, particularly some within ultra-Orthodox schools of Chabadniks. One group which has particularly captured the public's imagination is the Bohemian Club, a group originally founded by journalists, which later caught the attention of businessmen, politicians, and the wealthy. They meet in the now famous location of the Bohemian Grove, conducting sacrificial rituals with druid imagery. Yet some are much more public-facing. For example, Scientology became an extraordinarily powerful organization to be a part of. Particularly within the media business, this quite bizarre religious organization would use aggressive mafia-like tactics to support and defend their members, with many conjecturing that they functionally gained control over the LAPD. The Order of the Solar Temple is a quite curious case. Its beliefs were a bizarre blend of all sorts of different ideas, some traditional alchemy, some rooted in Christian mysticism, others more New Age and varied. Yet at their core, they believe themselves to be the successors to the Knights Templar, though it's quite difficult to know exactly what went on in the club. It's conjectured that they were particularly attractive to financiers. However, the order would meet with an unfortunate end, as there would be a great number of deaths. Oh, I know what you're thinking, something sinister must have happened. No. They helped them transit. That's what they did. In the 1980s, 2 members of a DC-based international society, the Finders, would be arrested and investigated for child abuse, with many reports of large numbers of children looking hungry, hurt, or in chains around the group's property. The group was noted as primarily being made up of young DC area professionals, practicing a sort of New Age mix of Eastern philosophies and New Age mysticism. What would be quite curious about this case is that after the investigation was dropped, documents would be uncovered lending credence to the idea that the CIA had compelled investigators to drop the case. To today, many people wonder if there was an association between the group and the CIA, particularly owing to the fact that there is an enormous international market for children, and seemingly nobody ever gets arrested for buying them. So the question goes, does the agency with its fingers in all forms of organized crime have its fingers in this market? And if so, is a DC area group involved with child abuse a part of it? Well, perhaps. Perhaps not. Is it an intelligence carve-out used as a node to connect to the much larger world of international human smuggling? Or simply an example of satanic panic fear based on nothing? Well, the international market for children is enormous. Intelligence agencies are highly integrated with organized crime, and many quite wealthy and powerful people, particularly politicians in Europe, have drawn quite a lot of suspicion for odd relationships with children that just don't quite add up. So are people simply being paranoid and creating fantastical stories? Perhaps. Perhaps in some cases. Perhaps in many cases. But it certainly makes real good sense why people are so suspicious. There are certainly a great many societies which have attracted the wealthy, powerful, and status-seeking. If you're somebody who is obsessed with power and status, then a secretive society which discusses hidden knowledge is too tantalizing to resist. Particularly in the 19th century, many theosophical, hermetic, and New Age movements were highly attractive to the upper class of Great Britain. Yet over time, many of those began to become quite hijacked by political ideologues, forming a sort of esoteric Marxism in the process. Ultimately, many of those groups were destroyed. Many had to break themselves down and reform in order to rebuild into something before its corrupted state. Yet many of those schools of thought continued. They morphed into new societies, into academic associations, into government, think tanks, and intelligence. Many point to the 18th century Bavarian Illuminati, a society much in the vein of the liberal Enlightenment thought that was emerging within Masonic lodges at the time, though much more overt and political. The fraternity was ultimately shut down by Bavaria's Catholic leadership, yet it is quite reasonable to conjecture that when very prominent people meet with a political and ideological agenda, they won't simply accept being closed down. Yet, what seems most likely is that over the centuries, a great multitude of organizations have formed, morphed, been destroyed, and reformed. Looking particularly at the 19th century as a clear example, a great many of the upper class who became involved in these societies were very evidently LARPing, enjoying the aesthetics of the occult, but not truly being believers, though this is not all of them. Certainly there have always been some who believe quite sincerely. In more recent decades, we have seen plenty of secret societies, cults, orders, clubs, and novel religions. Sound quite harmless, more like a goofy hippie commune, yet some ending up quite sinister, mass death, sexual abuse, and violence. So when trying to analyze the spiritual and philosophical beliefs of the people who move and morph the world, the market participants with whom you are competing, it's worth considering that the realm of ideas with which humans have played is much more vast than what people see every day. There are a great many different beliefs. There are a great many different societies. There are Kabbalists, New Age mystics, organizations which have formed their own unique brand. Perhaps some are good, perhaps some sinister. Yet when you see people having great success with highly atypical beliefs, perhaps it's worth wondering just what they're thinking about. Within the modern liberal materialist West, all too often, many people imagine that religion is a superficiality, imagining, for example, that deep believers in different Islamic religions will simply learn to cooperate the moment they reach Western shores, as liberal values will supersede it. Or perhaps they imagine that Christians and Jews should subordinate their beliefs to liberalism. They can't imagine how deep and immediate Hindu belief is to the Hindu, nor Sikhism to the Sikh. The realm of human thought is far more vast than what we see in the modern West, and to one who truly believes, that belief drives everything, for one's underlying ontological, metaphysical, and meta-ethical beliefs construct their worldview, their morality, their very notion of what one ought to do, and that can never be cast aside. Yet the modern materialist liberal is the same, tabula rasa in the state of nature, unsupported by neither philosophy nor modern science, yet held to as religious axioms, a metaphysical belief in a unidirectional linear history, being dragged along by some metaphysical current, leading to the millenarian endpoint of progress. No matter what we try to come up with, there will always be religious thought. And so it is worth looking deeper beyond the common, to beliefs of the ancient world, to beliefs in far-off corners, to beliefs of the brilliant, the strange, and the mad alike. For perhaps in some there is wisdom, and in others, delusion. Yet regardless, these are the thoughts which drive humanity. These are how we understand our reality. And so it is not at all surprising that people who would dedicate their lives to understanding markets, societies, economies, the underlying machinery that drives the modern world, would be curious in going beyond the mere material. When you look to people who take these ideas seriously, no doubt you will find the mystic and the madman, the sage and the fool, heroes of light and villains of the dark. Yet this has always been humanity's milieu. In this time where many of the presuppositions of Western society are falling apart, it's worth taking seriously ideas that have been left long neglected, for certainly some of the most successful men of history have given them great weight. Is our understanding of history correct? What of our minds, our conscious and subconscious being? Do we know our metaphysics? Are markets simply about numbers and values, or is there something deeper? And who are the men who make up these markets? Who make up the machinery of the modern world itself? Are they virtuous and misunderstood? Or are they wicked and villainous in the shadows? Or perhaps some mix of the two? Regardless, there is a realm of thought and ideas far more vast than what we see day to day in the modern West. And so, for someone who has a mind toward understanding our world, it's very worthwhile to look a little deeper.